What if, for one day out of every year, you had to make sure that you didn't have a single negative thought? A day where each complaint or nitpick could mean the difference between life and death. A day where even a single moment of dissatisfaction could rapidly morph into some horror beyond your comprehension. Could you do it? For 45 of the 46 people living in the small town of Peaksville, Ohio, that day is every day, or at least every day for the last 3 years, ever since the town's 46th resident was born. It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby tells a story of people living the very best lives that they can, under the watchful eye and attentive ear of a 3-year-old boy named Anthony Fremont. Like most children, Anthony can be helpful, or he can be an utter monster, depending on how he feels. Unlike most children, Anthony is capable of doing horrible, unspeakable things. That's why there are only 46 people left in Peaksville. Everyone else, well, they thought bad thoughts, so they went away to the Fremont family's cornfield. And the whole town prayed that those people would never return. The story opens with a young man named Bill Soames delivering groceries to Amy Fremont, who's passing the day watching her nephew play with some squealing, squirming thing in the front lawn. Overhead, the afternoon sun is shining bright. Part of this story's beauty is in the way it casually delivers deeply horrifying information, even right as the story is starting out. The second line tells us that Bill Soames was perspiring under the afternoon sun. The word sun is written in some awfully suspicious quotation marks. So the massive ball of fire overhead isn't the sun? Then what the heck is it? How did it get there? Where did the real sun go? I'll go ahead and tell you that this story has no intention of answering these questions. Not directly, anyway. Over and over again with this story, you'll see that Bixby makes some absolutely unhinged statements, then just refuses to elaborate on them unless you're willing to read between the lines. I'll be reading between the lines quite a bit in this video, but I also highly encourage you to check out the story for yourself and let me know what you think. There's a link in the description where you can read the story for free, as well as to an excellent audio narration if you prefer to listen. But before we continue to examine the horrors plaguing Peaksville, let's avoid the horrors of smelling bad with today's sponsor, Scentbird. Making yourself smell exactly how you want is one way that you can instantly improve your day, but it can be hard to find the right fragrance when bottles of cologne cost an arm and a leg. Scentbird is the service that brings you monthly fragrance options so you can discover what suits you best without breaking the bank or lopping off a limb. And look, I'm far from being an expert on cologne, but thanks to Scentbird, I don't have to be. They offer a free quiz that helped me discover fragrances that match my personality. This month, I got an old favorite, French Leather by Memo Paris, as well as a new fragrance that I've really been enjoying. But also, I have no idea how to pronounce this properly, so I'm just going to say it like the ignorant American that I am. Vetiver Imaginary. French Leather is perfect for when I want something subtle and professional, but Vetiver Imaginary has these incredibly bright citrus notes that I think smell incredible. As I mentioned, one of the biggest benefits of Scentbird is that you can try out fragrances like these that would normally cost hundreds of dollars per bottle without paying hundreds of dollars per bottle. A small bottle of French Leather costs $310, right? But with Scentbird, you can use my code to get a 30-day sample for only $8. And that's a pretty good bit that they put in there. So if you'd like to try Scentbird for yourself and start smelling amazing, use my code, CROW55, scan the QR code on the screen, or use my link in the description to get a massive 55% discount on your first month with Scentbird. That's code CROW55, scan the QR code, or use the link in the description for 55% off. Thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. While Bill is carrying his groceries to the porch, Anthony, the youngest Fremont, is playing in the grass a few feet away. Whenever Bill approaches, he notices that the thing Anthony is playing with is actually a rat recovered from the depths of the Fremont's basement. It's strange enough that a 3-year-old boy is playing with a wild rat, but it's also reasonable to ask how he caught the rat to begin with. That's how we learn about the first 2 odd abilities that Anthony seems to possess. Somehow, Anthony managed to make the rat think that it smelled cheese. Not to say that he made it smell something that it thought was cheese, but he made the rat think that it smelled cheese, and not just any cheese either. Instead, it was the most rich-smelling and crumbly, delicious cheese a rat had ever thought it smelled. More disturbing than the illusory sense of cheese is the fact that after the rat came out of its hole to get the cheese, Anthony took hold of it with his mind and started making it do tricks. So this, tiny little kid in the grass isn't just capable of creating the illusion of sensations, but his power is something more akin to straight up mind control or maybe even telekinesis. When the rat sees Bill, it panics and tries to run away, but the story tells us that Anthony thought at it and it turned to flip-flop on the grass and lay trembling, its eyes gleaming in small black terror. Watching the two little beasts rolling around in the grass, Bill decides that it's probably best to hurry past, and he starts mumbling to himself. We learn that Anthony's powers are relatively well understood in Peaksville, and that anytime people are around Anthony, they try to mutter meaningless information to themselves so that he can't read their minds. When you're around Anthony, you have to be careful about your thoughts, or else the boy who can think at a rat to make it turn flips might just think something at you, too. It doesn't necessarily have to be something bad, mind you. If Anthony picks up any distinct thought like, I wish this headache would go away, he might help you out with that. But here's the thing. Anthony is only 3 years old, and for all he's capable of, he isn't omniscient, and his way of solving a problem might actually make things worse. I can make those headaches go away, he might think. Then crush your head with his mind like a melon. Normal children are unpredictable as is, but Anthony is infinitely more so. Often, his powers exceed expectation, or even imagination, as you'll come to see. All that is to say, when you're around Anthony, it's better to think useless thoughts like 2 + 2 = 4, 3 + 3 = 6, 4 + 4 = 8, to save yourself the headache. Bill makes his way up the steps to the porch and delivers his groceries to the boy's aunt. She makes an offhand comment about how hot the day is, and it seems to set off alarm bells in Bill's mind. So much so that he interrupts his mumbling to try to gently correct Amy. Oh, don't say that, Miss Amy. It's fine, just fine. A real good day. Just like with the headache example, it was dangerous to think things like, it's too hot today. The townsfolk don't want Anthony causing a blizzard just because someone complained about being sweaty. So, no matter how hot it got, hell, horribly, terribly, miserably hot, it was always good that it was so hot. Besides, Anthony controls the weather year-round, so taking issue with the weather was taking issue with Anthony, and he didn't like that one bit. About a year ago, when Anthony was only 2, Amy had gotten after the boy for killing the family cat. I suppose the story doesn't say he killed the cat, just that he turned the cat into a cat rug. I'd hope it was dead by that point, but the story doesn't actually say that. Unfortunately for Amy, Anthony ignored even the barest sort of discipline back then, assuming that anyone was brave enough or foolish enough to attempt to reprimand him. Even so, he'd been good to Amy for about 2 years. Sometimes he'd even do as she said, but that time, the toddler had thrown a tantrum and lashed out at Amy with his mind. He thought at her and broke something inside of her. Something in her mind or her body or something in between. Now, Anthony doesn't obey anyone at all, and the young, once bright-eyed Amy Fremont simply rocks in her rocking chair for most of the day, a bit more empty than she had once been. She serves as a reminder that it doesn't matter if Anthony likes you or hates you, or even if you're part of his own family. You aren't safe around him. Amy assures Bill that he's safe, that Anthony likes him, and he wouldn't do anything to hurt him. She even calls out to Anthony and asks if he likes Mr. Soames. When Bill looks across the yard to where Anthony's playing, the boy's holding the rat, staring at Anthony with a look in his eyes that the story describes as a bright, wet, purple gaze. I don't think this description is meant to imply that Anthony literally has purple eyes, but more so that something about the boy escapes appropriate description. If you've watched my recent video on storytelling, you'll know I'm a huge fan of this approach, taking something indescribable and attempting to describe it even if you're describing it poorly. Even if Bill can't put his finger on just what's wrong with Anthony, this description tells us that there's something obviously inhuman about the boy, and you just have to look at him to know it. Bill tries to smile at the crouched being, but after a moment, Anthony returns his attention to the tightly clutched rodent. Anthony takes hold of the rat's mind and begins making it eat itself. It begins biting its tail, but he makes the little teeth chew more quickly than the rat can choke down its own meat, so little bits of flesh and fur fall to the ground. Then bone, than the entire tail. Still, the teeth keep gnawing. This doesn't disturb Bill too deeply. He's seen Anthony do worse than that, but it makes him want to leave the Fremont house even faster. Aunt Amy tells him that she and the other Fremonts will see him later that night, and he retreats back down the steps. He hops onto his bicycle and begins to pedal away, but he messes up and lets through a solid thought. I wish I could pedal away faster, get away from Anthony faster. It seems like Amy was right about Bill. Anthony does like him. So, Anthony grants his wish. The pedals of his bike jerk under his feet, and the young man zooms away in a cloud of dust, screaming down the dirt path to the Fremont house. Anthony, feeling very good about he had just helped his friend, looks down to the other friend in his hand. The rat is dead, overwhelmed by the pain of eating through its own stomach. Bored by the limp, bloodied, very nearly half-eaten corpse, Anthony thinks it away into a grave, deep in some remote corner of the Fremont family cornfield, just like his father told him he could. Inside the Fremont home, Aunt Amy is unpacking the groceries that Bill dropped off. One important aspect of this story is the fact that, for whatever reason, Peaksville seems to have limited access to products from outside the town. But it wasn't always like that. There are remnants of things, like empty cans of soup that had been eaten a long time ago. But now, everything the townspeople have to eat has to be grown, not opened. Amy tells her sister, Anthony's mother, that Bill brought the groceries for tonight, and she replies by saying that it's good. It doesn't matter what somebody says in Peaksville. The correct response is always to say that it's good or fine or swell or whatever, even if it absolutely isn't. Once, Anthony had heard one woman, Miss Kent, mourning for her husband Sam after he died. Later that day, Samuel Kent walked back from the graveyard and knocked on his door. So, now, even if someone dies, people say it's a good thing. Once again, Amy complains about Anthony making everything so hot, but this time, her sister is able to interrupt her. Amy stops and checks to see if Anthony was around to hear, despite knowing that it really doesn't matter if he's around to hear it. He didn't have to be nearby to know what they were thinking, but unless they did something to get his attention, he usually focused on his own thoughts. No one really knows what thoughts might catch his attention, however, so it's always best to think good thoughts just in case. The weather is just fine, says Mom. We never actually learn the names for Anthony's mother or father. The story only ever calls them Mom and Dad, almost like the entire story is told from Anthony's point of view. It's a very creepy thought to me to imagine that the entire story might just be like Anthony's perception of the world around him. But, I mean, I like that theory, but as far as I can find in the story, there's no, confirmation of that. I just think it's kind of a cool idea. In the kitchen, Mom and Amy talk for a while about plans for a party that's happening that evening. It's TV night, which means that tonight, the whole town is going to gather together at the Fremont house to watch TV. That sounds nice and all, but trust me, you probably don't want to go to TV night. More than that, however, it's also the birthday of another man in town, Dan Hollis, and so the plan is to throw him a big surprise party while everyone is together. To me, adding surprises into this situation seems very dangerous. Anthony thrives on control, and surprises might threaten that sense of control. So, why would the Fremonts even attempt to plan something as risky as a surprise party? I suppose you could argue that nothing ever really surprises Anthony, but I think it goes a little deeper than that. As Dostoevsky once said, the mystery of human existence lies not just in staying alive, but in finding something to live for. For the people of Peaksville, it isn't enough to simply mill about, following the whims of the waist-high tyrant holding the town hostage. Despite it all, the townsfolk really do care about one another, and they're doing their best to create a life worth living. To that end, they've tried to find ways of maintaining a sense of normalcy, of sanity, when they can afford to. That's what the party represents to them. It's their way of desperately clinging to the things that keep them sane in the face of a being that regularly shapes reality to its will. Outside, Anthony wanders towards the cornfield, past the family car where it sits useless and overgrown in the yard. He exits the far side of the cornfield and enters a lush grove where the animals like to congregate. The grove is actually a place of Anthony's own design. Or rather, it's a grove that Anthony shaped according to the desires of the birds, insects, and other creatures who frequent it. A monster he may be, but Anthony still has something like compassion for the little creatures, or maybe tolerance. So he created this as a sort of paradise where he could come and be with them. This part of the story is strangely serene. Anthony spends time feeling what the animals are feeling, experiencing their pleasure as they drink from the cool, clean spring, and turning his purple gaze up to birds gliding overhead. Noticing one particular bird, he imagines a nice big nest for it in the branches above, and that's all it takes for just such a nest to appear. Anthony enjoys the animals in the grove more than people because their thoughts are so simple. Simple like Aunt Amy had been ever since he changed her, and because animals are more apt to be grateful for his help. While he's resting in the grove, some sort of mammal comes to hunt the smaller creatures that are coming to drink from the pond. Almost immediately, he thinks the unidentified mammal away to a grave in the cornfield. The predatory thoughts it had been thinking reminded Anthony of a time when several of the townsfolk gathered near the grove and waited for him to come back to town. The text doesn't say this explicitly, but I think we can read between the lines a little bit and assume that this group was planning to slay the dragon, so to speak. It seems obvious that sooner or later, someone would try to kill Anthony, but they were the first and last to attempt to pull the trigger. Anthony just thought them all into the cornfield, and no one ever tried it again. Now, people try very hard not to think those thoughts. After that, Anthony spends some time playing with a bird, making it swoop and climb towards the clouds, but he ends up accidentally smashing the critter into a rock. He thought the rock away into the cornfield too, as a sort of revenge. Then we get to what is, to me, one of the creepier lines in the story. Anthony gets bored of the grove and decides to go back to the house. However, he didn't feel like walking back through the cornfield, so he just went to the house, right down into the basement. The idea of this wicked, watching thing suddenly just appearing in the basement of my home with no warning at all makes my skin crawl. Not only does Anthony know where you are and what you're thinking at all times, but he can also appear anywhere and do anything once he gets there. From the basement, Anthony can hear his mother thinking up above, planning for the people who will be arriving soon for TV night. He thinks back to the first TV night, where he had thought up a show for Aunt Amy. She had always liked TV, and he liked her, so he tried to make her happy. It worked, but it made Amy sad when the other townsfolk tried to leave. Anthony didn't want Amy to be sad, so he did something to them. The story doesn't really say what he did to them, but no one tries to skip TV night anymore. Around 6:30 that evening, Anthony's dad finally arrives home after spending the day picking, butchering, and preserving a cow. He's coming home late because, like everything in Peaksville, the entire process has to be done completely by hand. He takes a seat at the kitchen table and asks his wife for updates about Anthony, TV night, and the surprise party for Don Hollis. She begins to tell him about the gift the town is planning to give Mr. Hollis that night. A record featuring You Are My Sunshine, sung by Perry Como. I say it's new, but really that just means it had been forgotten or misplaced, this particular record being found buried away in the Dunn family's attic. The mention of the record launches the couple into a discussion of the state of entertainment in Peaksville, and we learn that the whole town basically works off a sort of bartering system. There's a collection of various items that can be used to pass the time and relax, things like records, books, or even mundane things like paintings. And the town exchanges these objects regularly in order to stave off the threat of overwhelming boredom. Amy, as usual, offers up a refreshing bit of negativity. Pretty soon, there won't be any more new things. We'll have found everything there is to find. Goodness, that'll be too bad. Amy is rarely fully present in any conversation, but I still appreciate the fact that she says what's on her mind, broken though it may be. Anthony's parents recognize the danger, and Mom sharply tells Amy not to talk like that. But that's a dangerous thing to say too. After all, what if Anthony hears her? What if he decided to help his mother by making sure that Amy never talked like that again? Never talked again. Anthony's dad interjects loudly, clearly speaking so as to be overheard by his son. "It's good," said Dad in the loud, familiar, wanting to be overheard tone of voice. "Such talk is good. It's okay, honey. Don't you see? It's good for Amy to talk any way she wants. It's good for her to feel bad. Everything's good. Everything has to be good. Everything had to be good. Had to be fine, just as it was, even if it wasn't. Always. Because any changes might be worse. So terribly much worse." At some point during this whole scene in the kitchen, Anthony's dad picks up and begins to snack on a carrot laying on the table. but he notices that the carrot is kind of young and tough. See, Peaksville is primarily an agricultural community full of farmers, and farming is hardly predictable. Infinitely more so in a world where the weather is controlled by a child with no knowledge of the seasons or how they affect the crops. Some seasons, everyone had to get by on less, and the whole town went hungry for a while. Once, however, Anthony had kept the weather just right long enough for there to be a grain surplus. Unfortunately, with no way to preserve that much produce, the town did what anyone in that situation would do. They drove truckfuls of the stuff out to the edge of town and threw piles and piles of grain into the nothingness surrounding Peaksville. This comment about the nothingness is one of those details that is deeply unsettling, but it's just kind of glossed over. It reminds me of the way adults have hard conversations around kids. Conversations about crimes or family secrets or things of that nature. We keep things vague either because we don't want to burden a child with something emotionally heavy or because we ourselves want to avoid lingering on the dark details. The interesting thing with this story is that Anthony probably knows more about the terrible things around town than any of the adults. There's nothing to protect him from. Instead, I think that the casual treatment of these horrors is something like a defense mechanism. The adults are protecting themselves. The villagers treat this like it's normal, because ruminating on the strangeness of it could morph into resentment for the one who turned their lives so strange. And as we've discussed, that can have disastrous consequences. Speaking of disastrous consequences, it's almost time for TV night. Around 8 p.m., folks start showing up on the Fremont's front porch. First came John and Mary Sippick, then the Smiths, the Dunns, and the Rileys. Pat Riley is one of Anthony's favorite people in town, mostly on account of him being able to play the piano. It seems that Anthony likes music quite a bit. Or, he likes the piano. The story tells us that once, someone had felt comfortable enough to sing along while Pat played, and Anthony had, quote, looked over from the top of the piano and done something that made everybody afraid of singing from then on. Another fun detail that's mentioned during this part of the story is that a man in town named Mr. McIntyre is building a loom to create new clothes and fabric for the villagers. Once, he'd wanted to make the most of the situation with Anthony, so he tried to convince the boy to think up some of the things that the town needed. Things like clothes or medical supplies, even gasoline. That plan was abruptly halted after something happened to the entire Terrence family and a man named Joe Kinney. We aren't told what happened to them, but whatever it was, old McIntyre blamed himself partly and has been trying to make it up to everyone since. Out of the 46 residents of Peaksville, 18 of them are always excluded from TV night. 17 children and Ms. Soames, who volunteered to keep them safe. In fact, the children of Peaksville aren't allowed anywhere near the Fremont house, not since a boy named Fred Smith tried to play with Anthony as part of a dare. Now, the parents just teach their children about the nice goblin that they must never go near. Friendly little reminder, Fred Smith's parents showed up to the Fremont house about half an hour ago, so they may very well be sitting in the same room as the thing that killed their son. So, tensions are probably pretty high on TV night. And hey, you know what? I hope that's all Anthony did to Fred. Yet again, we are only left with our imaginations to conjure a picture of what truly happened, because the story doesn't say that he killed him. It just says that Fred Smith played with Anthony one time, and now none of the kids are allowed to go near the Fremont house. So, yeah, just use your imaginations. This whole passage is a carnival of ambiguous horrors, constantly referencing things Anthony's done in the past and how those events shape the behavior of the villagers today. As you're going through the story, I think it's normal to question why people go along with Anthony as much as they do. I know that there's the story about Anthony coming back from the Grove and the group of people who, tried to ambush him, but you'd kind of think that other people would try to rise up or rebel against him in some way. And while I think that's normal to question, like those are good questions to ask, I also think that the story does a fantastic job at answering those questions. In some way, Anthony's greatest power over the town isn't a direct result of his borderline omnipotence. It has nothing to do with his strange little mind and its otherworldly powers. Instead, it has everything to do with how an ordinary human mind works, and how we're conditioned by our experiences to act in favorable ways. People don't rebel because they've seen what Anthony can and will do. They don't resist because they've seen that there are no holes in his armor. To us, all of these little, offhand references to past events are, that's the horror in the story. But to the people living in Peaksville, for them, all of these different experiences are lessons about how to live life in this world. Don't let your kids near Anthony. Don't tell Anthony what to do. Don't sing when Anthony is around. Don't try to kill Anthony. And, of course, don't think bad thoughts. So, finally, Dan and Ethel Hollis arrive to the Fremont house, and they are warmly greeted by the entire village. Everybody had done a good job of keeping their lips sealed regarding the party, and Dan is genuinely touched by the care they show him. They waste no time getting to the good part, opening presents. With so few new things in Peaksville, almost all of the presents are handmade and deeply personal. Mr. Hollis receives a carved wooden watch charm from John Sippick, a hand-knit necktie from Mary, a box, socks, shoelaces, some fudge, even a pipe, which he lights up then and there in the living room, which is very 1950s of him. Of course, the highlight of the gifts is the record. Before he can even open it, tears start to form in Dan's eyes. New things were so rare in Peaksville that every last item was precious. When he realizes that it's not only a record, but a record that no one in town had prior to the discovery or had even heard in years, he becomes almost overwhelmingly joyful. Ethel, his wife, is also overjoyed for her husband. This scene is honestly kind of beautiful to me. You've got these people, and they're terrified in every moment of their waking lives, but they still cling together with a lot of love, hope, and joy in spite of the fear. They pay attention to each other, know each other, and serve each other in very meaningful ways. It's how, in the face of such an overwhelming force, they reassure each other and themselves that things are going to be okay. It isn't going to be okay. Dan Hollis, practically humming with excitement about the record, asks if it would be all right for them to go ahead and play a bit of it, just up until Perry Como starts to sing. I think that was when the villagers realized that they might have done something a little foolish. It was good to care for Mr. Hollis, and no one wanted to disappoint him, but Dan knew the risks as well as anyone. Mr. Sippick tells Dan that they shouldn't, since things could go wrong if they accidentally stopped it a little bit late after Perry Como started to sing. Dan sets the record back on the table with all his other gifts and affirms that it's good that he can't play the record here. He says that, but his disappointment is obvious. It seems like such a small thing to be disappointed over, but consider what this moment actually means for Dan. Even here, in the midst of joy and love of an intensity that he may not have felt for a long time, Anthony still manages to slip in and poison it. This reminder of the hell that they're living in is too much for Dan, and it breaks something deep within him. He and the rest manage to keep on happy faces throughout dinner. They've had lots of practice, after all. They have the roast that Bill Soames delivered at the beginning of the story, as well as corn and a few other sides. I mention the menu because the story is careful to note that the corn isn't from the Fremont's cornfield. No one eats from the Fremont's cornfield anymore. Not since they realized where Anthony had been sending the things he killed. For most, TV night is easier than other nights of the week. It's easier to act happy when you sincerely enjoy the company of your neighbors. Miss Fremont decides that, since it's Dan Hollis's birthday and all, it's a good time to draw out the bottle of peach brandy that she'd been saving for special occasions. And as we're about to find out, that was a mistake. I mentioned a bit ago that when he couldn't play the new record, something broke inside of Dan. That something was his will to live. Needless to say, in a town where you have to take every thought captive, getting hammered probably isn't the best idea, but that's exactly what Dan does. He drinks glass after glass of the brandy, mixing it with the crappy homemade wine that the town had been attempting to ferment. While everyone is supposed to be sitting in the living room, chatting and having a fine time, Dan is holding his record, eyes locked on the Fremont's gramophone. Eventually, it's just too much for him, so he stands and shouts and swears, silencing the entire room. Every conversation ends abruptly, and they all just stare. Dan at the gramophone and everybody else at Dan. Pat Riley stops playing the piano, and the local reverend begins praying. It is deeply, uncomfortably silent for a long time. No one's moving. No one's speaking. Everyone is watching. Right now, the only mercy is that Anthony isn't present. His father tells Pat to start playing the piano again, but he can't play as well with the present distraction, or more accurately, with the present danger. A few of the villagers try to gently correct Dan, all while affirming that it's good for him to talk that way. It doesn't work. He yells in drunken frustration about the injustice of not being able to play his record on his birthday. Then he flings the half-empty glass of brandy he'd been drinking against the wall. The people's gentle petitions with Dan turn into more stern commands, then into outright begging as Dan begins to sing Happy Birthday to himself. He tries to get Pat Riley to play the tune on the piano, but Pat fearfully ignores Dan's request, instead continuing to play songs that Anthony likes, just how Anthony likes to hear them. Dan turns towards the Fremonts. You had him. He spits at them in condemnation, before squeezing his eyes shut, unable to hold back tears of sadness, fear, frustration, and outright anger. He starts to sing once more. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when I am blue. Without so much as a whisper, Anthony appears in the room, sitting atop the piano, and it's like everyone in the room is flash frozen. No one can try to stop it. Dan's wife, Ethel, can't even scream. Only Dan manages to choke out any sound at all. Please, don't take my sunshine away. Anthony responds with his only line in the story. Bad man, Anthony said, and thought Dan Hollis into something like nothing anyone would have believed possible. And then he thought the thing into a grave, deep, deep in the cornfield. The glass and record thumped on the rug. Neither broke. Anthony's purple gaze went around the room. Some of the people began mumbling. They all tried to smile. The sound of mumbling filled the room, like a far-off approval. Out of the murmuring came one or two clear voices. Oh, it's a very good thing, said John Sippick. A good thing, said Anthony's father, smiling. He'd had more practice in smiling than most of them. A wonderful thing. It's swell. Just swell, said Pat Riley, tears leaking from his eyes and nose. And then it was time for TV. The sort of TV that Anthony produces on TV night is nothing like TV before he had been born. For starters, no one has to turn on the box set for the images to appear. Anthony just imagines what he thinks should be on the screen, and there it is, and everyone has to like it. They have to enjoy the dancing colors and shapes on the screen, and they have to enjoy the horrible noises that come out of the speakers. There's no story, no characters, nothing that a human mind could latch onto and derive meaning from. You'd need a mind like Anthony's to understand it, but everyone still told him how nice it was, all the same. Behind them, John Sippick and two other men were on the couch, forcibly restraining Ethel Hollis, making sure she didn't scream too loud. While psychedelic images flow across the screen, Anthony's mother finds herself staring out the window, out into the infinite gray sky above town. The nothingness is easier to see at night, once the false sun has set. Once, she had wondered what happened to everything else and where they were now, but she had come to accept such questions as unanswerable. All she can know is that Peaksville is wherever it had been for the last 3 years. You had him. Dan's words hang in Mom's ears. Peering into the void, she remembers the day they arrived wherever they were now. The day she'd given birth to Anthony. The doctor had screamed and dropped Anthony the moment he saw him. Then, he'd tried to kill him. But even then, Anthony was too powerful. The infant had thawed away Peaksville to the little pocket dimension the villagers now found themselves in. Either that, or, with a single wish, Anthony had erased all of existence outside the town. The story doesn't confirm either way. It just leaves us with all the same questions that the villagers are left with. Recognizing her thoughts as bad thoughts, dangerous thoughts, Anthony's mom takes to the useless mumbling that had already filled the room. 2 + 2 is 4, and 3 + 3 is 6, and so on. The entire town was mumbling. And the final line of the story reads, "Next day, it snowed and killed off half the crops. But it was a good day." Now, I know I say in the title that you've probably never heard of this story, but that's not quite accurate. By far the most popular version of It's a Good Life is the film adaptation that was done in the Twilight Zone in 1961. If you've been in the horror community for a while, you might have heard of this episode. It's absolutely one of the best in the entire series, and it's how I found out about this story. However, it does take some departures from the original short story, which I never hear anybody talk about. I wouldn't say that either version is better, they're just different. I want to use this video to appreciate what makes the story so special, especially the original short story. The biggest strength of the story is its concept and presentation. The idea to concentrate supreme power into the irresponsible hands of a child is so interesting, and that idea is explored in such a nuanced way. Anthony isn't evil, not more than any other human. Most of what he does is his way of trying to help. He just doesn't understand that his help does more harm than good. However, I do think there's an aspect of evil within him. Fundamentally, the reason Anthony can't grow or learn to treat people better is because his childish pride is utterly intolerant of criticism. He mentally eviscerates Aunt Amy, possibly the only person in town who ever genuinely wanted to help the little devil, all because she told him he shouldn't have killed the family cat. Anthony is not an entirely pure soul. He's not an innocent child who's, just this blank slate that hasn't been nurtured right. But he also isn't trying to be some ruthless tyrant. He's capable of both good and evil, just like every other normal human kid. To me, that's the most frightening part of this story. There's no demon living inside Anthony, and he isn't some eldritch being from another dimension. He was just born wrong. Born so wrong, in fact, that it was immediately obvious to the doctor who delivered him. Born so wrong that the natural human reaction to seeing him is to try to exterminate him. Of course, that's only half the concept for this story. The villain is important, but we also have to consider how the other characters respond to the villain. The constant pressure on the villagers to think the right thing creates an incredibly unique reading experience. These characters are in a situation like no other, so they become characters like no others. They're people being pushed to the mental snapping point, and they combat that by taking care of one another. But they've also tried to do some pretty heinous things to Anthony in the past. Not that I necessarily blame them. One way that the Twilight Zone episode differs from the original short story is that during Dan Hollis's tirade at the birthday party, he very explicitly calls for the other partygoers to seize the opportunity to bash Anthony's head in. The entire scene is one of the most tense things I've ever seen set to film, and it's just soul-crushing when you realize that Dan is throwing away his life for nothing. Of course, in the text, it's heartbreaking for an entirely different reason. I love that Dan's final words in the short story are, "Please don't take my sunshine away." In a world that hasn't had a true sun in over 3 years. It's poetic in a twisted sort of way. The reason I decided to cover the short story instead of the Twilight Zone episode is because of all the little details I mentioned throughout the story. The horror in this story is understated in a way that implies way more depth than we are ever shown. We only ever see a single day of life in Peaksville, but this story is about just that, life. It should be clear to you at this point that there really is no categorizing the abilities that Anthony has. There's no discernible limit to what he can do. Mind reading, mind control, telekinesis, teleportation, the raising of the dead, and possibly even erasing most of existence are all on the table. It's no exaggeration to say that Anthony has godlike powers, entirely untempered by God's perfect morality or wisdom. That's part of why it's so important for the people of Peaksville to hold on to the lie. It's a good life. Not just because it's important to seem content around Anthony, but because the chance of having any other life would require ousting their omnipotent tyrant, an impossible feat. It's a good life. It has to be, because it's the only life they've got. And it's the only life that anyone will ever have again. I'm Curmudgeon. Thanks for watching.
I hope that you enjoyed the story. I know this is a slightly different style than I usually do, but I felt like being on camera would work better for a story like this, where there aren't really any visuals for me to draw from. I try not to depart too much from the storytelling fundamentals that I use in all of my videos, so I hope that I was able to deliver something that, kind of still feels like a Curmudgeon video, even if it's a little bit different. I also want to say a quick thanks to a couple of different people. First of all, a huge thanks to Michael Ramstead for doing the thumbnail for this video. I am very, very happy with how well he was able to bring Anthony's creepy purple gaze to life, and I'd love it if you went to check out his absolutely excellent horror art with the link tree in the description. Of course, I'd also like to give a huge thanks to my patrons and members for supporting the channel. As always, you help make these videos possible and are actively making the channel better. I know that in a few parts of this video the audio is a little janky, but by the next time I do one of these on-camera style videos, I'll be upgrading my microphone setup, and that's something I can only do because of the support you've shown, so thank you all so much. Finally, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this video, Scentbird. As a reminder, you can get 55% off your first month with Scentbird by scanning the QR code, using my code, CROW55, or using the link in the description. And with that, thank you all very much for watching.